Hello and welcome to this talk, the evolutionary impact of technology. So the idea behind this title or this topic is to look into what the technological world, the technological toolkit which we possess, what this means in terms of our evolution, what this means in terms of the way we can grow in consciousness, in terms of the way we can impact our reality, in terms of the way we can come to terms with our existential crisis and that of the planet. A lot of the ideas in this talk come from a great inspiration of mine, Terence McKenna, as well as some other speakers and inspirations. And he gave a talk, I think it must have been in the late 80s or early 90s, about the evolutionary role of technology, where he began to look at technology as a mediator for our very genes, as a mediator for our very expression, and as something that emerged out of nature, emerged out of this slow cooking process of biology, which eventually gave rise to humankind, and then the tool making, metal mining, technologically binding and manufacturing species that we are today. And so yeah, there's this kind of this inspiration here that technology is not necessarily apart from nature, apart from our planet, and if we can try and understand it in terms of this, perhaps it can reveal some truth and direction in our situation today. Okay, so in order to answer this question, I'm going to look at technology through three key avenues. The first one is its impact physically, the second one emotionally, the third spiritually. And just as a caveat, these are all very interwoven topic areas, but I just thought it would be interesting to understand it from these three areas to bring forward a more holistic perspective. So let's get into it. The physical impact. So I like to look at the example of the donkey, the car, and Skype. So back in history and early history, before the advent of the wheel even, we were using the donkey, or perhaps it was the horse in this case, but we were using the animal to transport us through time. This is how we got from point A to point B in order to save resources, in order to save energy, and perhaps apply it elsewhere. Cattle and animals formed the basis for a lot of trade, and even for people surviving long distances in terms of nomadic farmers herding animals, goats, sheep, and this kind of thing. But anyway, back to the point. We began coming from A to B, transported by the donkey, through time and through the advent of certain technologies like the car. We were then able to transport ourselves at a quicker rate. And what this means is that we were able to impact our reality in a much more different way. We can now have a meeting with somebody in one state or in one country, and in the same day we can get to the next. We can simply drive there. That before was an impossible challenge, it was an arduous challenge where you would stay in many inns, be hosted and come into many adventures. But the point is, we're now able to operate at a greater scale and at a greater speed. And we look at Skype as well. And I've kind of put this in the physical impact category because I think it's relevant to see how, again, this technological disposition that we've now created with the digital sphere is enabling us to transcend these barriers of time, transcend these limits of time, and begin now within the same day having a conversation with somebody in India, in China, in the US, in Gibraltar, wherever it may be in the world. We can now tie together all these relations. We can now move our impact around the world. So what does this mean for humanity? What does this mean for our evolutionary path? Well, now our actions speak in global terms. A message that comes to an inventor, an idea that comes to an inventor, a message that comes to a communicator, a new political regime born in the mind of somebody can come into the global perspective, can come into the global picture, can come to influence the huge scope of humanity, our entire species, which is the predominant culture and arguably the driver of the destiny of this planet. So I think there's this much greater speed and scale at which the human endeavor can materialize itself. And so the underlying creativity, the subconscious as it arises into the conscious can now meet reality at a much quicker rate. So that's the physical impact. We're now going to move into the emotional impact. So kind of touching upon this, again, technological revolution, this world we live in today, of smartphones, of relentless and open access to information. We're seeing the ability to now communicate and to a degree empathize with the rest of the world, with these global perspectives. So before, let's put it in the colonial era, people in the UK saw people, or heard of people, not even saw people, heard of people going to the Americas, starting their colonies there, facilitating this quite detrimental human act of slave culture and these big sugarcane plantations and this sort of stuff. And to the innocent or to the everyday person in the UK, this cultural paradigm would have been kind of accepted. What people would have heard would have been a single flow of information coming back. They wouldn't have heard the perspectives of the slaves, so much so. And this picture and ethos that creates inequality and creates this perception of, they're like animals, they're not humans, these blacks are there to work the lands and they're from an uncivilized world. That's the story you would have picked up, believed, and swallowed, you know? But now we can see the story of the other. We can see perspectives of the other, you know? This is quite arguable. There are still some higher powers controlling the media and this kind of thing that we receive, but as a general tendency, as a general occurrence, information is much more boundless now, and the source does not have to come from a hierarchy, a top-down approach. It's now been democratized. So the way in which we can understand the world, and importantly, the way in which we can shed our cultural conditionings, is really opening up a new possibility for us understanding our world emotionally and forging ahead in our evolutionary path as a human species. So we now move into the spiritual perspective, and for the sake of this argument, I define spirituality of the act of coming to meet our soul, the act of coming to connect to that which nourishes us, that which elevates us, in a way that is not so rational, in a way that happens kind of between the lines, in the way that music moves you. And so how is this spiritual picture, this spiritual dimension of humankind being impacted by the revolution of technology? I think if we kind of focus on the digital age for this, it's interesting to consider how technology is kind of allowing for this widespread of information, like we said, and so the music of today, the art of today, the poems of today have a greater what's the word for this? Have a greater surface area for us to interact with. There's this constant flow of information that we're able to kind of interact with, and more so, it's more relevant than ever. So because of the now progression out of mechanization, out of simple digital and electronic technology, and into artificial intelligence, into algorithmic intelligence. We're now seeing these algorithms deliver content to us. So we're receiving what's relevant based on our search histories, based on our interests, based on many complex factors that our social tribes, our time spent engaging with things are now influencing. And so I think there's a great opportunity here for the spiritual dimension of humanity, these rivers, these digital rivers of inspiration, to start infusing into our action, infusing into our work. And just from the other perspective, that's the perspective as the receiver, but from the perspective of the creator, of those creating the music, of those creating the sonnet songs and poems of this generation, they can now speak to the world. They can elevate themselves with the totality of the audience that can now plug in. And I feel that has a certain electricity to it, that has a certain enlivening factor that it brings. You know, today I'm in my home alone, and the fact there's a camera here, the fact I'm visualizing that I can speak to others, generates a new form of creativity, a new form of perspective, a new ambition to discover this question in itself. So I think in this sense, technology is empowering our spiritual dimension through amplifying the cross-section of information available to us and the relevancy of that in this time. So far it's all been quite airy-fairy. There hasn't been too much doom and gloom in this equation, but just to kind of balance things out, I thought I would give a couple of perspectives which trouble me when it comes to technology, and challenge this idea of it being an empowerer of our physical impact, our emotional impact, our spiritual nourishment. And let's go into the scrolling aspect first. So I think we can all relate to the situation, mosquito. We can all relate to the situation when we're tired, it's the end of the day, and we just kind of resort to the quickest small satisfaction of scrolling on the iPhone. And we're just scrolling, and before we know it, half an hour's gone, before we know it, 45 minutes have gone, before we know it, our neck is aching, our posture is out, and we've just been kind of consumed, zombified by the phone. More so, there's now this word called nubbing, which is the verb to describe when you choose to have a kind of conversation with your phone or engage with your phone instead of engaging in the more challenging or socially awkward situations that you might find yourself in, you know? And so we have this very immediate, this very kind of dopamine fueled technological distraction that's in our lives. And I think a lot of our culture, I see a lot of the youth, I see a lot of it myself, a lot of the time we kind of abuse these technologies, and they're really creating a detrimental effect on our biological health, on our social health, on our cultural health in general. So this is something that is kind of challenging, and connected to this point is also about quality of information. Just because there is more access to information, just because it arrives to us on a so-called more relevant basis, is more information is perhaps poison, just like too much of anything. You know, drink too much water, something supposedly good and hydrating for your body, and it can kill you. You can die from overhydration. So I think it's the same for information, and we really have to be mindful on our diet of information, especially when it comes to empowering these dimensions and forging ahead in our evolutionary path as an individual and as a collective culture. So there's another point as well here. I kind of touched upon it before, but I'd like to go into it a little bit more deeper, and it's a real physical, postural, mind-body thing. The fact that we spend so much time now having to impact our realities with our fingers, with our hands, in this kind of bent over T-Rex position on a computer, is kind of primitive, you know? it's actually quite slow when you think about it compared to the potential of having something more gestural or something like moving our body or moving sound to actually control and engage with our environment. It's actually very limited, and our bodies are in a very limited position. Our nervous system, which is dependent on our spine, our spine is very contracted, and our nervous system dependent on this kind of very function and the fluidity and openness in this space, is really being dramatically impacted here. Our nervous system is in charge of operating many biological functions, regulating certain organs. Every single thing that really goes through our body is regulated by our nervous system, and it is our antenna for perception. It is what differentiates us from feeling stress in fight or flight, or feeling calm and grounded and human, you know? So I feel there's a really important aspect here which kind of got a bit diluted in the way I expressed it, but in that technology is really creating this physical contraction, this lack of mobility, this lack of fluency in the dynamic and biological system that we are. That as well troubles me in arguing this towards the positive. Nonetheless, it is important to acknowledge that there are certain virtual reality technologies, augmented reality technologies, motion capture, gesture-led voice activation, Siri, which we probably, or many of us have experienced. All these kind of technologies opening up the dialogue between us and our tools. And I do feel that it's moving in a direction where perhaps something that more closely resembles a symbiosis between human and tech can be achieved, and who knows, perhaps this unites us into a whole new current, a whole new flow, and we can still be technologically driven, space-minded, but at the same time honour our biology, and at the same time honour the full scope of our naturalness. So those are a couple of critique points that question this, and I think what I'll do here is I'll sum the whole thing up. So, as we've discussed today, technology is something that in a sense has emerged out of nature. It has emerged out of us. It is here for a good reason in our path of evolution, and it beholds certain impacts on our physical, emotional and spiritual body, so to speak, in terms of widening the impact of our approach, deepening the impact of our approach, spreading the impact of our approach more relevantly. And if there is goodwill, if there is love, creativity, humble human intent behind these impacts, behind what the technology leverages, then I feel it has the capacity to really evolve the face of this planet and ourselves as we know ourselves. There's also certain constrictions in terms of social implications, biological implications from the overuse of technology, from mindless scrolling, from the diluted information that we may take on in having too much of it. And there's a tension between these 2 points. It's interesting to see where it's going to go in the next few years, but what I would say is I think it all lies in the relation. It all relies in our relation to technology, and if there's anything practical to take away from this talk, it's going to be to question our own relation to technology, question how much it's controlling us, how we are in control of it, or put it in a kind of different way, how much we are abusing it, or how much we are really using it as a tool to empower our lives, our communication. And I think the way that we can answer this question is not so much in a generalistic fashion. It's not going to be a yes or a no. There's going to be aspects of both. And I think in coming to acknowledge the aspects that deteriorate from our health, deteriorate from what we may perceive as evolution, we can find some new awareness there. We can find a little bit of space to begin influencing and changing our actions. And just to come back to this, answering this question for ourselves, I think it's something that happens in every moment. It's not something we can say yes or no to. As I said, it happens in the moment, as we engage, we must ask the question, we must be critical of our actions if we really are to steer the way and embrace these means that we have today, in honor of our planet, in honor of our natural systems, in honor of our own biology and the human destiny that awaits us. So I think I leave it there. Thank you very much for listening to this talk. I'm planning to do more of these, and you'll be able to find them on this YouTube channel. You can check out my work, which involves a lot of these tension points and intends to communicate this kind of technological fusion, this fluidity that we can achieve in and amongst technology. You can check out more of my work at christianchainart.com, and also follow me on Instagram at christianchainart. So once again, thank you very much for listening to this talk. Thank you.